She had two suitcases. One was small and worn around the edges. Inside were a few dresses, several photographs, and the letters from her husband, carefully wrapped and protected. The second suitcase held everything else that could somehow be called a new life. A pair of shoes, a hairbrush, a prayer book, a few small kitchen items, and a gift for the American mother-in-law she knew only through letters. As the ship slowly approached the pier, the young woman saw cargo cranes, warehouses, tugboats, automobiles, and people waving from behind the barriers. Somewhere among them, her husband was waiting. She had imagined America through movies, magazines, and the stories told by American servicemen. She had thought about skyscrapers, glowing signs, and expensive automobiles. But during her first weeks in the United States, those were not the things that held her attention. America revealed itself through a light switch on the wall, a clean towel, a slice of soft white bread, and a refrigerator that an American family opened without the slightest concern. The things they barely noticed seemed to a young woman who had just survived a war like evidence of an almost unbelievably well-ordered life. That was how thousands of different stories began. Not every German war bride arrived in the same year. They did not all cross the Atlantic aboard the same ships, and not every woman came directly from a bombed-out city. Some had met their future husbands while working as interpreters, telephone operators, or clerks in American offices. Others met an American soldier through relatives, at a dance, in a hospital, or during the occupation. Some waited for permission to leave Germany for months. One woman crossed the ocean with a group of other young wives. Another flew to the United States. A third traveled by train to the port, holding her documents so tightly that it seemed as though her entire right to a future depended on those papers. Their experiences were different, but nearly all of them had one thing in common. America was their husband's country, and they knew far less about it than they wanted anyone to realize. Behind the confident smile at the pier was a simple question. What would the house be like where he was taking her? Behind her was a Germany where the end of the war had not meant an immediate return to normal life. The streets of many cities ran between piles of broken brick. Several families might share the rooms of a single surviving apartment. Windows were covered with boards or fitted with whatever pieces of glass could be found. Fuel was carefully rationed. Hot water was a luxury. A conversation about meat, sugar, coffee, or butter often began not with the question of price, but with the question of whether the item could be found at all. Ration cards, bartering, long lines, and the black market had taught people not to choose, but to take whatever was available. In one museum interview, a future war bride recalled being paid by Americans with apples, bananas, and chocolate, because during those first post-war months, money could not always buy the things people actually needed. So when she arrived in the United States, she did not compare what she saw with glamorous pre-war advertising. She compared it with the last years of her own life. The first challenge was the language. In Germany, her husband had spoken slowly. He chose words she knew and used gestures when necessary. In America, everyone seemed to speak at once. A porter asked about the luggage. A cab driver wanted the address. Relatives welcomed her while talking over one another. A radio played somewhere in the background, and a newspaper vendor shouted the latest headlines. A woman who had studied careful textbook English suddenly discovered that people in New York, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Louisiana seemed to speak different versions of the same language. Elizabeth Bolster later remembered that regional accents confused her so badly that her husband sometimes had to translate English into a kind of English she could understand. It was her first amusing discovery. She had crossed an ocean and learned a foreign language, only to arrive in a country where her American husband still had to act as her interpreter. After leaving the port or railroad station, they usually climbed into an automobile. That alone could change her first impression of her husband's family. The car was not necessarily new. It might start with a roar, smell of gasoline, have worn seats, and rattle stubbornly over every bump in the road. But it belonged to an ordinary man. He was not an industrialist or a wealthy landowner. He might be a mechanic, a postal employee, a factory worker, or a young veteran just beginning his adult life. He drove the car to work. He used it to bring home groceries and visit his parents. And now he had used it to meet his wife. By 1950, tens of millions of automobiles were traveling America's roads. Of course, not every household owned one, especially poorer families and people living in certain urban neighborhoods. But the presence of an automobile in the life of an ordinary worker said something important about the country. Here, a car was no longer only a symbol of wealth or status. It was gradually becoming an ordinary family tool, almost an extension of the home itself. The new house was often more modest than American movies had led her to expect. It might be a small house in town, an apartment above a store, a farmhouse, a wooden home at the edge of a mining community, or 2 rooms in the house of her husband's parents. After the war, millions of returning servicemen needed housing, and young couples often began married life in crowded conditions. But the German bride noticed other things. There was a walkway leading to the door. The curtains were intact. Near the entrance stood a mailbox or a box where the milkman could leave bottles. 2 chairs might sit on the porch, and no one carried them inside at night for fear they would disappear. Beside the house, there might be a neatly trimmed lawn. She was told that the grass had to be cut every week, and at first she could not understand why anyone would spend so much effort on grass that could not be fed to animals or dried for hay. The American lawn became the first of many things whose only practical purpose was to make the space around a home feel peaceful and attractive. Her mother-in-law opened the door, embraced her, said far too many words at once, and led her into the house. The young woman put down her suitcase, removed her coat, and watched someone press a switch. The lamp came on immediately. There was no ceremony in the gesture. No one checked whether electricity could be used at that hour. No one hurried to turn the light off because of air raids, shortages, or failing power. By the late 1940s, electric lighting had long been standard in most American urban homes, and by 1950, electricity had reached the overwhelming majority of the country. Conditions could still be different on remote farms and in poorer rural districts, but to a newcomer from war-damaged Europe, simply knowing that the lamp would work that evening, the next morning, and the following week carried a special meaning. The light did not promise luxury, it promised order. The electrical outlets said even more. One powered a table lamp, another powered the radio, a third was used for an electric iron. Electricity did more than illuminate the rooms. It made machines work in place of human hands. At first, the bride might cautiously ask whether one appliance should be unplugged before another was turned on. Her American relatives did not understand the question. They simply used whatever equipment was already in the house. Old wiring did not always tolerate the growing number of appliances. Many families knew the smell of an overheated extension cord or the sudden pop of a blown fuse. Still, the number of electrical devices showed the direction in which everyday life was moving. After a Europe where people repaired a single hot plate for months or guarded their last working light bulb, an American house seemed designed not merely for survival, but for comfort. Yet the real surprise was waiting behind the bathroom door. The bathtub was inside the house. Beside it stood a flushing toilet. A mirror hung above the sink, and water came directly from the faucet. In some homes, all she had to do was turn a second handle, and the water became hot. A woman from a comfortable German city apartment might have known indoor plumbing before the war. But after bombing raids, evacuation, freezing rooms, shared wash basins, and years of limited fuel, an ordinary bathroom no longer felt ordinary. There was no need to heat several pots of water, carry them upstairs, or make sure no one else needed the same water first. A person could take a bath simply because evening had arrived. Not every American house in the 1940s had a complete modern bathroom. Rural areas in particular still lagged behind the cities. But a family with indoor plumbing and hot water might treat these things as routine, while the new daughter-in-law saw in them something close to the restoration of human dignity. Then she noticed the heating. The house was not necessarily hot, and Americans also tried to save fuel. Some rooms might be warmer than others. In rural areas, families still relied on wood stoves, coal, furnaces, and kerosene heaters. But urban homes were increasingly equipped with systems that carried heat through several rooms. There was no need to light a separate stove every morning in every part of the house. There was less chance of having to sleep fully dressed because the fuel had run out during the night. Warm air rose through a floor register, or radiators slowly heated the rooms. The young woman might wake in the morning and take a moment to understand why the air did not feel painfully cold against her face. To the American family, it was simply a working heating system. To her, it meant that winter no longer required a daily struggle. A wide bed waited in the bedroom. Sometimes it looked so large that she jokingly asked her husband whether the entire family intended to sleep there. The bed had clean sheets, several pillows, and a decorative bedspread that was not needed for warmth at all. There were hangers in the closet. Empty dresser drawers had been prepared specifically for her clothes. Fresh towels lay on a chair. Not one towel for everyone in the household, but several. For middle-class families, a separate bedroom for a married couple was a common goal, although many newlyweds still lived with their parents. The very idea of personal space could feel new. After years when people had slept in basements, barracks, farmhouses, shelters, and overcrowded apartments, the ability to close a door and be alone with her husband seemed almost like a privilege. A telephone stood in the living room. It was not in a post office, a government building, or the home of a wealthy neighbor. It sat directly on a small table inside the house. The telephone might be connected to a party line, allowing several households to hear the same rings. Long-distance calls were expensive, so relatives spoke quickly and watched the clock. A telephone was still far from universal, but in the homes that had one, the bride watched with fascination as Americans used it almost casually. Her mother-in-law picked up the receiver and called a repairman. Her husband telephoned his employer. A neighbor called to say she would stop by that evening. People and services became accessible without a trip across town. The strangest invitation was, "Call anytime." In Europe, a telephone call often suggested urgent business. Here, someone might call simply to ask how the day had gone. Near the telephone stood a radio, sometimes large enough to look like a piece of furniture. The family switched it on in the morning and let it play while breakfast was prepared. They listened to the weather forecast, music, news, comedy programs, and baseball games. The radio did not always make everyone in the room fall silent. It became another voice in the household. Josephine Joyce recalled that in 1947, her husband bought a Zenith radio with a record player. He hoped she might be able to receive broadcasts from Vienna, although distance and technology did not allow the idea to work as he had imagined. The gesture was more important than the result. Her American husband saw more than a piece of equipment. He saw a possible bridge between her former life and her new one. Later, records appeared beside the player, and European classical music began to fill an American room. But the greatest surprise was waiting in the kitchen. At first, she noticed not the food, but the way the room was arranged. There was a proper counter where meals could be prepared without balancing pots on a chair. The cupboards had shelves. The drawers held knives and spoons. A clean dish towel hung near the sink. Some kitchens had a gas or electric stove with several burners. Coffee could be made while eggs were frying, and water was heating in another pot. Not every kitchen looked like an advertisement in a magazine. Older stoves smoked. Cupboard doors sagged. The linoleum was worn thin near the table. Yet the room was practical. It had been arranged so that an ordinary woman could feed her family every day without turning each meal into a complicated search for fuel, equipment, and ingredients. Then someone opened the refrigerator. Cold air touched her face. A small light came on inside, and for several seconds the young woman simply stood there. On the shelves were a bottle of milk, eggs, butter, cheese, leftovers from the previous night's roast, a jar of jam, and several small containers of sauces and condiments. Vegetables rested in the lower drawer. Sometimes there was ice cream in the freezing compartment. By 1950, mechanical refrigerators were already widespread, especially in urban and suburban homes, although poorer households and some farms still used iceboxes or simpler methods of food storage. What mattered to the newcomer was not the shiny appliance itself. It was the calm attitude of the people who owned it. They did not look at the food as though it were treasure. The milk was there because the milkman would bring more. The eggs would be eaten and then replaced. She might ask whether the family was preparing for a holiday. Her mother-in-law would answer that these were simply the groceries for an ordinary week. The word ordinary was the hardest part to understand. After the war years, the presence of meat did not mean that relatives had to be summoned immediately to share a rare piece of good fortune. Butter was not being saved for a special occasion. Sugar was not hidden in a jar where children could not reach it. If a child asked for another glass of milk, someone poured it. American families still lived on budgets. Many watched every penny, stretched a roast over several meals, and refused to waste even a slice of bread. The generation that had lived through the Great Depression understood the value of food very well. The difference was confidence. Tomorrow, food would be available in the store again. Stability mattered as much as quantity. Her first American morning began with the sound of a frying pan. Bacon sizzled in the skillet, and eggs were cracked beside it. The coffee was made from real ground beans rather than a substitute. A sugar bowl stood on the table beside milk or cream. The bride might take one spoonful of sugar, look questioningly at the others, and then add a second. No one stopped her. No one warned that the supply had to last until the end of the month. Josephine Joyce recalled that after her arrival, relatives gave the newly married couple a package of good food. Among the items was bacon, something she had not seen for years. Unsure of how they planned to prepare it, she tasted it before it had even been cooked. That small story expresses the difference better than any economic chart. To the American family, bacon was an ordinary breakfast food. To the newcomer, it was a flavor she had nearly forgotten existed. Then the bread popped out of the toaster. The toaster itself seemed amusing. A person placed slices inside, pushed down a lever, and continued the conversation without watching a flame. A few minutes later, the bread emerged by itself. But American white bread was even more puzzling. It seemed too soft, too evenly shaped, and almost weightless. The German woman was accustomed to dense loaves with firm crusts that required a proper bread knife. An American slice could be squeezed between the fingers until it became a tiny ball. Her husband insisted that it was perfectly good bread. She looked at him doubtfully, then spread butter and strawberry jam across the top. It was one of their first harmless disagreements, and that made it especially pleasant. After years when people argued about war and survival, they could now argue over what counted as real bread. A box of ready-to-eat cereal appeared on the table. Identical flakes fell from a brightly colored package into a bowl, and cold milk was poured over them. The young woman asked whether this was food for children. It turned out that adults ate cereal too, especially when they were in a hurry to get to work. Her family explained the names of different brands, and she could not understand why one simple product required so many choices. Some cereals were sweet. Others had almost no flavor. Still others came in boxes decorated with smiling cartoon figures. Advertising spoke to the customer as though each box had its own personality. For a woman accustomed to buying whatever grain happened to be available, the transformation of breakfast into a consumer choice seemed oddly American and slightly amusing. Even more mysterious were the jars and bottles stored in the refrigerator door. Ketchup, mustard, mayonnaise, salad dressing, pickles, and sweet pickle relish. Americans placed all of them on the table at once and allowed each person to decide how the meal should taste. She cautiously tried ketchup and asked why a sweet tomato sauce was put on almost everything. Her husband replied that Americans did not put it on everything. Then he added it to potatoes, meat, and eggs, immediately disproving his own argument. Mayonnaise seemed much too thick. Peanut butter appeared to be a product that had somehow been given the wrong name. Its stickiness made her reach immediately for a glass of milk. Before long, some of these flavors became familiar. Others remained family jokes for years. The American pantry opened another world. Inside were cans of tomatoes, beans, peaches, soup, tuna, condensed milk, and several products whose contents she still could not identify after reading the labels. Europeans were familiar with canned food, but the variety and availability were striking. A housewife could prepare dinner more quickly because part of the work had already been done in a factory. Open a can of soup, add water, heat it, and the first course was ready. For a woman raised to believe that a good homemaker should prepare everything herself, this initially seemed almost suspicious. Then she noticed that her American mother-in-law was not lazy. She was saving time for laundry, children, church work, community meetings, or a paying job. Convenience was not considered a moral failure. A package of frozen vegetables might be waiting in the freezer. By the late 1940s, such foods were entering the kitchens of many urban consumers, although they did not yet fill entire supermarket aisles as they do today. The woman picked up the package and felt the hard peas beneath her fingers. The vegetables did not have to be shelled or cleaned, and the season no longer mattered as much as it once had. A vegetable that had previously appeared only in summer could now be served during winter. Nearby was the ice cream. It was not divided into tiny portions to make it last. On Sunday, the father might bring home an entire carton, and the children would gather around the table before it was even opened. To the war bride, the scene did not look like the wealth of millionaires. It looked like the return of normal childhood, a childhood in which a sweet treat did not have to be saved for months as a rare reward. Pies seemed to hold a special place in American life. A neighbor might arrive to introduce herself while carrying an apple pie with both hands. A relative brought cherry pie. At the diner, lemon, chocolate, and pecan pies waited behind glass. The newcomer began to feel that America expressed affection through baked goods. To welcome someone, bring a pie. To raise money for the church, sell pies. To invite the family over on Sunday, bake a pie. She knew elaborate European cakes and pastries, but the American custom of covering fruit with pastry and serving a large slice with ice cream seemed both simple and generous. A few years later, she might bake her own version, using less sugar, while listening to her children complain that Grandma's pie had been sweeter. Sunday dinner revealed another kind of abundance. Her husband's parents, brothers, sisters, children, and older relatives gathered around the table. At the center might be a chicken, a beef roast, or a ham. Potatoes, beans, corn, salad, bread, and gravy were passed from person to person. The dishes moved around the table. The conversation grew louder, and someone asked for seconds. The German bride noticed that the Americans were not arranging this meal to display their wealth or social position. They gathered because gathering was what the family normally did. After a war that had divided families across oceans and borders, simply knowing that the same relatives would probably return, the following Sunday seemed extraordinary. The greatest abundance was not the number of dishes. It was the regularity of family life. The kitchen held more than food. In the corner, there might be a washing machine. It was not a modern automatic washer. It could be a heavy machine that had to be filled with water, watched carefully, and used with rollers that squeezed water from the clothing. Those rollers required caution. Still, the machine saved a woman from scrubbing every sheet and shirt entirely by hand. During the 1940s, many households did not own washing machines. Some families used laundromats or shared equipment, but even a basic wringer washer seemed like a true household assistant. The young woman watched the sheets turning in the water and imagined how much strength such a machine might have saved her own mother. American appliances did not eliminate housework. They made it less exhausting. After washing, the laundry was still carried into the yard. Clothes dryers were not yet an ordinary feature in every home. Sheets moved in the wind. Shirts were fastened with wooden clothespins, and towels became stiff in freezing weather. Here, the German homemaker felt more confident. She knew how to hang laundry properly, how to smooth out wrinkles, and how to bring everything inside before the rain. For the first time in her new country, she had found a task she did not need anyone to teach her. Her mother-in-law might remark approvingly that the new bride was an excellent housekeeper. That small compliment mattered. For weeks, the language and unfamiliar appliances had made the woman feel almost like a helpless child. Now she was an experienced and capable adult again. Then someone brought out the vacuum cleaner. It made so much noise that it first sounded like a piece of industrial machinery. The family pulled it from a closet, connected the hose, and moved it across the carpet, collecting dust without throwing it into the air with a broom. Vacuum cleaners had existed in Europe, and a prosperous urban household might have owned one before the war. But post-war destruction had made any functioning household appliance seem rare. In America, she saw these machines not behind the window of an exclusive store, but in the homes of ordinary people. An electric iron heated without coal. A toaster required no open flame. A mixer whipped cream. Each appliance saved only a few minutes, but together they changed the entire working day of the homemaker. For the first time, the future seemed not only peaceful, but physically easier. Her first trip to an American grocery store made an even stronger impression. Her husband parked the car, took a metal shopping cart, and pushed it toward the entrance. Shopping carts had appeared before the war and were common in many larger grocery stores by the late 1940s, but they were not present in every town. Small communities still relied on neighborhood groceries, butcher shops, bakeries, and general stores. For that reason, a war bride's first experience of American retail could vary greatly. One woman entered a brightly lit supermarket with long rows of shelves. Another arrived in a small town where the storekeeper knew every customer by name and still brought goods from behind the counter. Yet even a modest American store often offered what post-war Germany could not: a regular supply of goods and the right to choose. In a larger store, her eyes moved quickly from shelf to shelf. Several brands of coffee stood in front of her. There were different kinds of soap, entire rows of cookies, breakfast cereals, canned food, and sauces. The same product might be sold in a small, medium, or family-sized package. A shopper could compare prices, read a label, put one box back, and choose another. No one said, "Take it now because it may be gone tomorrow." No one asked for a ration card proving that she had the right to buy sugar or cooking fat. The young woman waited for her husband to explain how much they were permitted to purchase. He told her that the only limit was the amount of money in their wallet. That did not mean the family could afford everything. But poverty and scarcity were not the same thing. Even a person with a small budget could decide for herself which product to go without. She did not learn the decision from an empty shelf. At the meat counter, she slowed down. Behind the glass were carefully cut pieces of beef, pork, and poultry. The prices were clearly marked. The butcher wrapped the selected cut in paper and might offer advice on how to prepare it. The woman remembered years when a rare portion of meat had to be divided among several people and every piece of fat was saved for another meal. Here, the customer chose between bacon, ham, ground beef, and different cuts of roast. She might decide that a particular piece was too expensive and select something cheaper, but the meat remained there in front of her. An American family did not treat the butcher counter as an exhibition of impossible luxury. It was simply where they decided what to have for dinner. The produce section offered oranges, apples, bananas, lettuce, and corn. The selection still depended on the region and the season. Post-war stores did not provide the same year-round abundance that modern shoppers expect. Even so, America's network of railroads, highways, refrigerated freight cars, trucks, and warehouses allowed food to travel enormous distances. Elizabeth Bolster remembered receiving American apples and oranges while still in Germany, where they seemed almost unbelievable. Now entire crates of fruit stood before her. She picked up an orange, tested its weight in her hand, and put it back. No one became angry because a shopper had touched the merchandise and chosen a better one. At the checkout counter came another discovery. The clerk smiled and asked how she was doing. She began to answer seriously, trying to explain her long journey and her exhaustion, until her husband told her that it was only a common greeting. Americans asked the question without always expecting a full report. The cashier might compliment her coat, ask whether she had recently arrived, and call her husband by his first name. The customer did not feel like a petitioner waiting to be handed a scarce product. The store wanted her to return. Friendly service had a commercial purpose, but to the newcomer it also felt like respect. She was allowed to hesitate, ask questions, and even return an item that did not suit her, an idea that initially seemed almost improper. The American drugstore was another mystery. It sold far more than medicine. One counter offered tablets, bandages, and toothpaste. Another displayed cosmetics, greeting cards, magazines, toys, and small gifts. Some drugstores had soda fountains and lunch counters where customers could order a drink, ice cream, or a simple meal. A woman entered to buy aspirin and discovered people sitting on tall stools drinking milkshakes. She did not yet know the names of the items and might choose by pointing. A huge glass of something cold appeared in front of her with a straw. The American drugstore was at once a pharmacy, a shop, and a gathering place. A roadside diner seemed just as unusual. There were chrome surfaces, a long counter, a waitress carrying a pot of coffee, and pies protected beneath glass covers. The menu could fill an entire page, even though many of the meals were different combinations of eggs, meat, bread, and potatoes. The portions seemed enormous. Ice was placed in drinks even when the weather was not hot. The young woman carefully asked whether the restaurant was using the ice to give customers less of the actual beverage. Her husband laughed and explained that Americans simply liked everything cold. In Europe, ice in a drinking glass had not been an everyday necessity. In America, it arrived automatically, as though water had to prove its freshness by its temperature. Vending machines also required a certain amount of trust. A person inserted a coin, pressed a button, or pulled a handle, and the machine released a bottle. No clerk stood beside it. No one wrote down the customer's name. The mechanism itself promised that a particular coin would always produce a particular product. Sometimes the bottle became stuck, and the machine swallowed the money, revealing the less magical side of American technology. But even this small device demonstrated the scale of the system. Drinks were manufactured in identical batches, transported across the country, and sold without another person being present. To a woman accustomed to small shops where the supply depended on that day's delivery and a particular shopkeeper, the vending machine seemed like one more part of a new kind of order. In the morning, she heard glass bottles clinking near the house. The milkman arrived, collected the empties, and left fresh milk. In another neighborhood, families might receive bread, ice, coal, or groceries at the door. The mailman followed a regular route and brought letters directly to the house. This reliability made almost as much of an impression as the filled refrigerator. The service worked not because the family was wealthy or influential, but because the entire neighborhood was included on the route. The young woman learned to leave a note for the milkman, place the empty bottles outside, and check the mailbox. In Germany, a letter from America might have been an event awaited for weeks. Here, the mail became part of the ordinary rhythm of each day. Catalogs appeared in the mailbox. They were thick books filled with clothing, furniture, dishes, tools, toys, and household appliances. A person could live far from a major city, select an item from a picture, complete an order form, and have the merchandise delivered. For American rural families, mail order catalogs had long served as a connection to the national marketplace. The German bride turned the pages slowly, almost as if she were studying a museum collection. She was interested not only in the number of things, but in the fact that they were intended for ordinary buyers. A dress came in several sizes and colors. A table could be ordered together with matching chairs. A toy appeared in a child's home not because it had been found through a lucky barter, but because the parents had selected it in advance. The catalog transformed a wish into a plan. A department store strengthened that feeling. There were several floors, elevators, mannequins, and separate departments for shoes, dishes, fabric, and cosmetics. Elizabeth Bolster recalled that soon after her arrival, she wanted a pair of nylon stockings with seams up the back and purchased 2 pairs at once. To an American woman, this might have been an ordinary purchase. To someone arriving from a country where clothing had been altered, patched, and repaired until nothing more could be done, the new stockings represented a return to femininity and peaceful life. She could select a size, look at herself in a mirror, and think not about whether her coat could survive one more winter, but whether the color of the stockings matched her dress. One ordinary American custom, however, seemed completely incomprehensible: the Saturday family shopping trip. A husband, wife, and children climbed into the automobile, drove to a shopping district, visited several stores, ate lunch at a diner, and returned home with a full trunk. Buying groceries had almost become entertainment. The children asked for cereal because they liked the picture on the box. The father examined tools. The mother compared fabrics, dishes, or kitchen equipment. The German woman had learned to regard the search for food as a burden involving long lines and heavy bags. Here, a family might spend half of its day off shopping and return home in a good mood. Advertising followed her everywhere. It spoke from the radio, looked out from magazines, and appeared on billboards beside the highway. Soap promised to make a person more attractive. Coffee guaranteed a happy morning. Automobiles were shown beyond beautiful houses and smiling children. After wartime Germany, where public messages and advertising had been subordinated to the government and the war effort, an appeal to buy a new brand of laundry detergent seemed almost like an innocent luxury. Of course, advertisements exaggerated. Appliances broke. Coffee did not save a marriage. A new automobile could mean years of payments. But the nature of the promises had changed. People were no longer being told to endure deprivation for victory. They were being encouraged to make their own lives more comfortable. Her first long automobile journeys revealed the true size of the country. Her husband might say that his sister lived very close by. The bride put on her coat, expecting a short walk, and he led her to the car. An hour later, they were still driving. After 2 hours, they stopped for coffee. She discovered that close by in America could mean another town or even the other side of the state. The size of the country changed the meaning of family and everyday life. Americans maintained relationships across distances that in Europe could have carried a traveler into another country. The automobile, the telephone, and the mail connected those distant points and turned several hours on the road into an ordinary weekend visit. The roads were wide, although they were not always perfect. The future interstate highway system had not yet been built. Travelers followed federal and state highways that passed directly through towns, farmland, and the main streets of small communities. Motels, filling stations, billboards, and diners appeared along the road. The young woman studied the map and could not understand how her husband confidently chose a route among lines stretching for hundreds of miles. After a short stay with relatives, Elizabeth Bolster traveled west with her husband by automobile. They went so far that she later joked that, had they continued much longer, the country would have ended at the Pacific Ocean. To a European woman, the simple decision to climb into a car and drive across the country in search of a place to begin a new life seemed remarkably bold. A filling station was a performance of its own. An attendant approached the automobile, filled the tank, cleaned the windshield, and sometimes checked the oil and tire pressure. The driver did not need to get out. Once again, the system seemed designed around the convenience of the customer. The attendant might give directions or recommend a good place to eat. Even a small purchase included a human conversation. The young woman, still struggling to understand spoken English, smiled at what she hoped were the proper moments and prayed that no one would ask her a question. Later, she would learn to give directions herself using American landmarks. Drive 2 miles, turn after the red gas station, and keep going until you reach the white church. Women behind the wheel caught her attention. American women drove to the store, took children to school, visited friends, and helped with family businesses. This did not mean that men and women had achieved complete equality, but the automobile already gave many women practical independence. The new bride might consider driving too difficult, dangerous, or improper until her mother-in-law calmly took the wheel and suggested they go shopping for fabric. A few months later, the husband began teaching his wife on an empty road. The car stalled and lurched forward while English instructions mixed with German exclamations. Receiving a driver's license became an important step. Now she could travel to the doctor, the store, or her child's school without depending entirely on her husband in a country that was still unfamiliar. Outside the cities, the space seemed nearly endless. Fields stretched toward the horizon. Farms stood far apart. In one state, the road passed through forests. In another, it crossed flat plains. Somewhere else, there were dry landscapes and mountains. The German woman expected a village to appear around each bend, but sometimes she traveled for miles without seeing a single house. Then a small town appeared with a main street, a church, a drugstore, a movie theater, and an American flag near a public building. These places did not necessarily look wealthy. The houses were wooden. People wore simple work clothes. A local automobile might remain in the same family for many years, but the streets functioned. Stores opened on schedule. The mail arrived. Children attended school. That dependability created a stronger impression of prosperity than any single expensive object. A rural house might have fewer conveniences than she had expected. Not every farmhouse had an indoor bathroom, a modern refrigerator, or central heating. The family rose before dawn, carried water, repaired machinery, and depended heavily on the weather. The history of war brides should not be turned into a picture in which every woman stepped directly from European ruins into a perfectly equipped suburban home. Some arrived in difficult conditions and worked extremely hard. Even there, however, they noticed the land, the animals, the food stored in the cellar, the family car or truck, and the ability to sell what the farm produced. An American farm could be a harsh place, but it also gave its owners a sense of space and independence. In the evenings, neighbors sat on the porch. Someone passing by waved. People greeted one another even when they had never been formally introduced. A stranger might immediately use her first name because formal address seemed unnecessarily distant. At first, the German woman interpreted this as a lack of proper boundaries. It took time to understand that a friendly Helen or Elsie was not intended as disrespectful familiarity, and an invitation to come over for coffee did not always require a special occasion. American openness had rules of its own. People began conversations quickly, although they did not always become close friends just as quickly. Still, for someone who had arrived without her own family, even casual friendliness made the first months easier. Neighbors brought pie, a casserole, or a jar of homemade pickles. Relatives arranged a welcome gathering where everyone tried to speak slowly and loudly, as though volume could replace translation. They asked her to describe Germany, and then interrupted because they wanted to show her photographs of her husband as a child. Someone produced a map of Europe and confidently pointed to the wrong country. Another person remembered several German words learned during military service, most of which turned out to be commands or names of foods. The young woman laughed with everyone else. Good-natured humor became a shared language long before she could speak English fluently. She was invited to church. For many families, the congregation was not only a place of worship, but the center of community life. People collected clothing, helped the sick, organized dinners, taught children, and introduced newcomers to their neighbors. Her husband's denomination might be different from her own, and the style of worship might seem unfamiliar. American church members sang differently, talked more freely after the service, and quickly included the newcomer in community activities. Someone offered to help her with English. Someone else passed along children's clothing. Another woman simply sat beside her so that she would not have to be alone. The support did not always come from a government program. Often, it came from ordinary people who considered helping a neighbor a natural responsibility. English lessons took place everywhere. Her mother-in-law pointed to an object and named it. Children corrected her pronunciation without the slightest concern for politeness. Her husband explained one word by using 5 other words that were even more confusing. The radio helped her become accustomed to the rhythm of American speech, while newspapers helped with spelling. The most difficult things were often not the names of objects, but small expressions. "See you later" did not always mean that the two people would meet again that same day. "Come by sometime" might be nothing more than politeness, but it could also be a genuine invitation. "Not bad" could mean real approval. Each small detail made the foreign country a little more understandable. American children also appeared unusually free. They asked adults questions, joined conversations, and sometimes argued with their parents at the table. To a woman raised in a stricter environment, this could look like poor discipline. A child called a familiar adult by a first name, asked for a different dessert, or openly announced that he did not like the food. But behind that freedom, she saw confidence. The children were not afraid that their house, school, or father might disappear tomorrow. They planned birthday parties, summer vacations, and Christmas presents. Their small wishes existed in a world where adults could once again keep their promises. Thanksgiving was one of the most difficult American holidays to explain. Her husband talked about the early settlers, the harvest, and the family tradition, but the meaning became clear only at the table. Relatives she had previously seen only in photographs arrived at the house. The turkey occupied almost the entire oven. Someone prepared stuffing. Someone else brought sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, and pies. Before eating, the family gave thanks for the house, their health, and the safe return of the men from war. The young woman might not understand every word of the prayer, but she understood its meaning without translation. For people who had survived the Great Depression and a world war, gratitude for an ordinary full table was not an empty ritual. Christmas brought the two cultures together more easily. She already knew the tree, candles, hymns, and a family meal. But an American Christmas differed in the amount of decoration, the number of greeting cards, and the piles of presents. Toys were hidden inside brightly colored paper. Stockings hung near the fireplace. Children waited for Santa Claus rather than the figures she remembered from European childhood traditions. She could bake German cookies, decorate the tree with familiar ornaments, and discover that she did not have to abandon her former life completely. Her American family accepted the new recipes, mispronounced their names, and asked her to prepare them again. In that way, two traditions entered the same household. Later, the children would regard both of them as their own. Yet the most important discovery was not food or machinery. It was the ability to plan. Her husband received his wages on a particular day. The family knew when the electric bill would arrive. They could save money for furniture, a car, a child, or a house of their own. Buying on credit carried risks and required discipline, but it allowed people to think years ahead. After a period when one bombing raid could destroy an apartment, and the following week depended on ration cards and a lucky trade, an ordinary household budget could seem almost luxurious. There were limits, but there was also predictability. Working services strengthened that feeling. If a pipe broke, the family could call a plumber. If a child became ill, they called a doctor. If documents were needed, there was an office with an address and regular business hours. The system was not perfect. Lines, mistakes, expensive services, and bureaucracy existed in America too. But the new resident gradually learned whom to contact. A problem no longer automatically became a personal catastrophe that had to be solved through bartering or special connections. She collected telephone numbers, receipts, insurance papers, and instruction booklets. These dull pieces of paper became signs of a stable life. Sometimes she was astonished by the things Americans considered inadequate. Her mother-in-law complained that the refrigerator was too small and needed to be replaced. A neighbor wanted another car, even though the old one still ran. A magazine described a kitchen as outdated because of the shape of its cabinets. The young woman looked at perfectly usable objects and could not understand the desire to discard them. In Europe, an item was repaired for as long as the process could still reasonably be called a repair. Gradually, she saw another side of the American economy. Factories had returned to producing civilian goods. Companies competed with one another. Advertising persuaded people to replace old equipment with something newer. This created jobs and made homes more comfortable, although it could also seem wasteful to her. She learned to live with abundance without abandoning the habit of taking care of things. Large restaurant portions remained a source of family jokes. She ordered a salad and received a plate that could have fed several people back home. The waitress offered free refills of coffee. The main course came with bread, potatoes, and vegetables. Out of politeness, she tried to finish everything and then could barely leave the table. Her husband explained that the remaining food could be taken home, although asking for it to be wrapped initially seemed humiliating. Later, she learned to request a smaller portion or calmly carry half of her dinner home. American generosity was sometimes measured by the size of the plate. Corn raised questions too. In parts of Europe, corn might have been associated mainly with animal feed or flour. Here, an entire ear of corn was served to a person, covered with butter, and eaten with the hands. The bride watched her relatives and tried to determine the proper technique. Even more amusing were popcorn at the movie theater, sweet canned corn, and cornflakes for breakfast. One crop appeared in so many different forms that it seemed Americans were determined to prove its versatility. These small discoveries were not great cultural conflicts. That was exactly why people remembered them. Through food, a foreign country slowly became a home. At the movie theater, she saw another side of peaceful America. There was a brightly lit lobby, colorful posters, a line at the ticket counter, and the smell of popcorn. Movies were no longer accompanied by the fear that an air raid siren might interrupt the show. The audience laughed, children whispered, teenagers came on dates. For a young woman who had loved American movies in Europe, the screen and the real country finally began to come together. But the real America was still different from Hollywood. Most men did not wear perfect suits. The houses were smaller. Family automobiles required frequent repairs. That difference made the country more convincing. Comfort did not belong only to movie stars. Its modest forms surrounded ordinary people. In time, she began to notice the price of this way of life. Her husband rose early and drove to work. Her mother-in-law cooked, cleaned, sewed, and watched the household expenses. The father of the family repaired his own roof, painted the fence, and changed the oil in the car. Prosperity had not fallen from the sky. It was built through mass production, labor, productive farms, roads, stores, and the habit of solving practical problems. American practicality could be expressed in one simple question: what has to be done to make this work? If the church needed more benches, the congregation raised the money. If a neighbor became sick, people brought meals. If a family needed another room, relatives helped build it. For the war bride, one of the most important things was the absence of any feeling that a bad situation had to remain permanent. A young couple might first live with the husband's parents, then rent an apartment, and later purchase a small house. The husband might study through a veteran's education program, search for more skilled employment, or open a small business. Not everyone succeeded, and not every marriage had a happy ending. But the possibility of moving from one stage of life to another was visible all around her. A neighbor described beginning with nothing. A relative remembered his first used car. The house itself showed signs of gradual progress: an added room, a newer refrigerator, a replaced stove. The future could be constructed one piece at a time. Some German women tried to become outwardly indistinguishable from Americans as quickly as possible. They shortened their names, avoided speaking German, and learned their mother-in-law's recipes. Others kept their accents, prepared familiar foods, and continued writing to relatives in Europe. Over time, many combined the two worlds. A German cake appeared on the American table. At Christmas, the children heard two versions of the same song. The husband became accustomed to stronger coffee, and the wife became accustomed to ice in her drinks. Assimilation did not happen in a single day at the pier. It was created through thousands of small decisions: which language to speak at home, which bread to buy, what to teach the children, and which photograph to place on the mantel. Real memories reveal how individual these journeys were. Elizabeth Bolster arrived from Bremerhaven after a 2-week voyage, carrying a suitcase of clothing and an accordion. In New York, she purchased 2 pairs of seamed nylon stockings, stayed with her husband's relatives, and then traveled west with him. Josephine Joyce arrived by airplane with a suitcase and a teddy bear. She met her future husband in New York and was soon traveling with him toward Florida. These women did not describe one universal America. One eventually lived in Utah. Another built a family life in Pennsylvania. But their accounts repeatedly include travel, food, appliances, music, new relatives, and the long effort to turn an unfamiliar country into a home. A few years later, the woman who had once been afraid to enter a store by herself was arguing with the butcher about the price of meat. She drove an automobile, made a doctor's appointment for her child, called the neighbor, and knew which department store was holding a sale. Her accent remained, but her children had heard it since birth and did not consider it unusual. The refrigerator before which she had once stood in silence was now opened by her sons, who complained that there was nothing to eat even though the shelves were full. She answered with a sentence that could have been spoken by any American mother. "Close the door. You're letting all the cold air out." Gradually, the things that had once seemed incredible faded into the background. Hot water became simply hot water. The washing machine broke at the worst possible moment and caused irritation rather than wonder. Grocery shopping became a chore. The telephone rang too often. The family car required expensive repairs. This transformation of a miracle into everyday life meant that the journey of immigration was complete. She was no longer observing American life from the outside. She had become part of it. A homemaker, a shopper, a neighbor, a mother, a worker, and eventually an American citizen. Her children grew up surrounded by things for which their mother had once felt almost physical gratitude. They did not know what it meant to save sugar for a special occasion, or wake in the morning, uncertain whether the house next door was still standing. For them, the lights always came on. Milk waited in the refrigerator. Relatives lived only a few hours away. Their mother could describe the past, but she could never fully communicate the distance between those two worlds. And perhaps that was her greatest achievement. The next generation had been given the right to consider safety ordinary. America did not welcome these women with palaces or the fabulous wealth of millionaires. Most of them joined workers, farmers, postal employees, mechanics, railroad men, and young veterans who were only beginning their adult lives. Their houses might be crowded. Their automobiles might be used. Their bills might be difficult to pay. But the light came on. The store opened in the morning. The mailman returned the next day. The family gathered on Sunday. A neighbor brought a pie. A husband talked about what they might buy next year rather than what they might lose tomorrow. That became the central discovery of the German war brides. After years of destruction, they were not most impressed by the luxury of the wealthy. They were impressed by the dependability of an ordinary day, the ability to choose a bar of soap, to pour a child another glass of milk, to heat the house to call a relative, to climb into an automobile and drive for hundreds of miles, knowing that the road did not lead away from a war, but toward a family celebration. America did not promise them a life without hardship. It offered something more convincing. It gave them the ability to make plans again. When the young woman first stepped off the ship, there was almost nothing inside her suitcases that could fill an American home. But over the years, that home collected children's photographs, school drawings, Christmas ornaments, dishes received for anniversaries, and recipes written in 2 languages. The country that had first revealed itself through a light switch, a refrigerator, and a shopping cart became the country where her children grew up. And if someone asked what had truly shocked her about America, the answer would not have been the skyscrapers or Hollywood. It was the fact that an ordinary family could speak calmly about next Sunday, next Christmas, and next year, and believe that the future would actually arrive.